Hi, this is Pastor Barry with the supplement video for Mark 14, verses 17 through 52, the discussion entitled Betrayal of the King. We will talk about the passage in just a minute. A few housekeeping details. One is that this is the week before the missional activity. So if your group has not planned the missional activity, be sure to email out and have the conversation either in email or at this discussion so that you know what you're doing next week. Second thing is to think about where you are in the calendar, the bigger context of where your group is and where it's headed. A couple of things to consider. One would be we're a month from the end of the Mark series. And the end of any series is a good time to think about wrapping it up a bit to help people to remember what have they learned? What have they, how have they responded to the words of Jesus? And what were the results of that? And what kinds of questions do they still have? Your group should get used to the idea that not every question is answered by the end of every discussion. Some questions take longer, they're open-ended, and we have to continue to press into God to get the answers that we're looking for. Another bigger picture calendar kind of thing is that we're coming up on summer. So the end of this series could also be the end of your group for a while. Traditionally, discipleship groups at Lighthouse have done something different during the summers. Many of them have gone on hiatus. Some of them have gone on vacation together. Some of them meet once a month for some fun kind of activity so that they don't lose touch. You have choices to make. But don't let the choices sneak up on you. Don't show up during the final week of your group and say, oh my gosh, we have nothing else to study. What are we going to do? Think about it ahead of time. It's loving to your group, and it also helps with your leadership credibility to have thought about and prayed about, maybe done some research on these things ahead of time. And on that last, let me encourage you to be at Invest. The final Invest meetings are Tuesday, May the 14th at 7, and Sunday, May the 19th at 9 a.m. You come to one or the other, and we'll talk about closure, and we'll talk about what's coming next in terms of Sunday morning messages. And we'll talk about options that you might have, things that are here in the office, or maybe things that you've thought of for yourself. Very possible that we're going to have DSLs, discipleship seminars at Lighthouse this summer, although those are not yet planned. At least the topics are not yet planned. One thing, as you think about closure for your group, if you're ending for a time in the summer, even if you're not, you're just coming to the end of this series, think about this. How can you help your group to close well? You close the series well or close the group well? Do you want them to affirm one another? Do you want to have a big potluck or a special meal out at a big buffet? Do you want to do something fun as a group? Do you want to have some kind of affirmation time so that the group can say what it is that they've appreciated about each other, about the group, about each person in the group, something like that. And if you need ideas for that kind of thing, Invest is a great place to learn about that. We're going to talk about how do you bring closure to your group and send them off well. Also be thinking about next year. Should your group multiply in the fall? If so, who's going to lead that group? Do you want to split, and in what fashion? Who's going to go with whom? So that you can begin praying and planning. If the fall is too soon, consider multiplying in January. But I want you to consider multiplying. I think it's healthy when groups multiply and get new people. It's invigorating, it's challenging, and it keeps us from becoming too stale, too complacent. Okay, let's talk about Mark 14. The passage that you're looking at is actually in the middle of a long chapter. Your group could try to do the whole chapter, but it is a long chapter. And so I have tried to summarize what came at the beginning of Mark 14, and you'll get the summary of what is at the end of Mark 14 at the beginning of the next study. So you can read that so that your group knows what's going on. Read it out loud so your group knows what's going on. But yeah, I think it's an awful lot to get through. I think the study is fairly easy to follow. I'm not going to go question by question or section by section through this passage. I will try to give bits of background and some suggestions that may help you. So in this first section about what Jesus tells us about his betrayer, what Jesus tells us about his betrayer, and what the feeling is behind his words, it's helpful to know that in that culture, both Middle Eastern culture and in the Jewish culture, eating together is very significant. You don't eat with just anyone. So to sit at a table together is a statement about your relationship. It's a statement about intimacy, about trust, about being like family. And so that may help you and your group as you think about, how is Jesus feeling at this point? What must it be like for him to say the things that he's saying? And what must it be like for them to hear these things? So there's some imagination work going on here. You're projecting yourself into Jesus's place and then into his disciples' place to try to envision what they must have felt like. You may be able to draw on situations where people have been a part of a betrayal, where they've betrayed someone or where they've been betrayed, and to have them talk a little bit about that. You don't want it to take over the study, but to be able to get at those feelings. You could even open the study. I didn't write this, but you could open the study with a question about, have you ever had a situation in which either you were betrayed or someone betrayed you? Without talking about the exact situation, to talk about what the feelings were. What was that like for you? What do you think it was like for the other person? To help get at some of these questions. Now, obviously, what we're trying to do is to help people to understand just what a painful situation this is. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so Jesus in the garden. What is going on here? What instructions does he give them? What is he hoping for? And how does that turn out? It's interesting that Jesus's instructions beyond sit are keep awake and pray. And if that keep awake sounds familiar, it should, because it's the same instruction that he gave to them at the end of Mark 13. So what does he mean when he talks about keeping awake? Is it just physical wakefulness? Or is there something else in mind that he wants them to be awake for, to pay attention to? And I think in that Mark 13 passage, we see that in part what he's talking about is living faithfully. And in this case, living faithfully has to do with staying physically awake and praying. There's a lot here about how Jesus reacts in this situation, the pressure that he's under, the grieving. And, your group could talk about, what does that tell us about Jesus? I mean, I think part of what it says is that Jesus really is human. He has come in the flesh. So he is God, but he's God in human flesh with all that entails of true humanity. I think that he is hoping that they can pray, that they will be faithful. And interestingly, it's not that he'll pray for them. I'm sorry, not that they'll pray for him, but rather that they'll pray for themselves. The goal here is that they will be able to stand firm in the time of testing. And of course, later in the passage, we find out how that turns out. Okay, so then in that last section, which has the arrest and the actual betrayal of Jesus. I think the thing that stands out to me is just how ironic this whole section is. I point out these things in the guide, actually. The fact that that Judas not only betrays Jesus, but that he chooses to betray him with a kiss, with a sign of friendship and intimacy. He could have said anything he could have used anything as a sign. And the fact that he used that sign was just a reminder of how close he and Jesus were and of their relationship and of all that he was turning his back on. It is just a horrible situation. There's also this mysterious story in verses 51 and 52 about the young man who is sleeping naked and runs away. They grab the sheet and he runs away naked to get away. I relate this back to Mark chapter 8, where Jesus says that if we would be his disciples, we have to deny ourselves and take up our crosses and follow him and be willing to lose our lives for this sake. And this guy does the exact opposite. He literally leaves everything behind so that he won't be associated with Jesus. What are we seeing here? Well, in part, what we're seeing here is that having prayed, Jesus is ready for the test and he is faithful. The disciples are not ready and they're not faithful. The important thing about this passage, or one of the important things about this passage, is to make sure that you get to the application, to talk about ways that you identify with the disciples, and to talk about what it would be, what it would mean for you to keep awake and to pray. There's a lot that we can learn from this passage, but if we can't find in ourselves that vulnerable place of the possibility of betrayal, of the need for the power of the Holy Spirit to be able to stay faithful, if we can't be honest with one another about the places where we've fallen short, then I think we're missing out on how this passage can really be an encouragement to us. Jesus is able to foretell all of these things, his betrayal, his impending death, and all of these things, which should be an encouragement to us, that he knows what's coming to pass. It's not like things are spinning wildly out of control, but he knows, and he is still able to get things done. Okay, last thing I'll say is this: on the bottom of your guide, there is an article that talks about the Passover from a Jewish point of view. I think it gives a lot of insight into what this meal meant in the time of Jesus and what it can mean for us as Christians. A lot of what a lot of our Bible and a lot of our faith is rooted in the Old Testament, in the faith of the Jews, and we need to become familiar with these things. If you prefer a video, you can look on YouTube for a video entitled Christ in the Passover. It's put together by Jews for Jesus. It's about 40 minutes long, definitely worth your time to watch either by yourself or with your group. Well, that's everything. Thank you for serving in this capacity, for investing in the lives of other people. And, I am praying that God is going to show up. Like Michael Coe said at our church retreat, it's not just going to be encouraging words about Jesus that you can think about and try to figure out what to do with later, but that there will be an encounter with Jesus as we study his word, as we pray for one another, as we obey his word. So let's be looking for the encounter with him.